Well, let's begin with prayer. May these words that I speak be grounded in my soul, encouraged by the God presence in me. And may these words that you hear be captured by your soul and enlivened by the God presence in you. Amen. Well, it becomes obvious that as you listen to Gordon read the story this morning, that this lesson from John's Gospel is another of the resurrection stories. Stories about how and when Jesus appeared to the disciples in the days and weeks after Easter. And of course, you'll recognize this story. It's quite famous. It has even added a term to the English lexicon by calling someone a doubting Thomas. In this telling of this story, it's usually about how doubting Thomas comes to experience and believe that Jesus has risen. And that's the usual focus of the story. Makes sense because that's what John focused on in the story. But on this occasion, as I read that story in preparation for what we were going to look at today, I was immediately drawn to the community and how they responded to Thomas. I suppose in part it was because I was looking at that vision of community and then the other vision of community in Acts, which was the other story. How did they react to Thomas? Because all of the rest of them are caught up in the wonder of the good news, and they're really excited about it, that Jesus is not dead, that he's risen. They must have been wondering what it could mean for them and their lives, and there was probably a lot of chatter in the community about what that meant and how they were supposed to live and how Jesus was going to be with them. All of that happened until Thomas shoved a stick into the spokes in their wheels. I'm not going to believe until I actually see the wounds and touch him and know that he's real. Only then will I know it's really him. As I said, never before when I read this passage has my mind gone to the community of which Thomas is a part. I suspect that's because John's storytelling is focused on Thomas and how his life was transformed. And it also, I imagine, is because his doubting is so quickly brought to a resolution when just a few days later Jesus appears to him and he becomes one of the crowd who believes the same as the others. And I suspect that the other reason that my mind doesn't usually turn to the community when I read this passage is that the community is so much like our community, not much different. I can think of all sorts of situations where the congregation has been divided by one group of people thinking one way and another group of people thinking another. You can think of any kind of scenarios. One that just comes to mind is that there's a congregation that's experiencing a lot of growth with young people coming, teenagers and children, and the building has become too small, and so they begin to decide that they're going to have to expand to provide more room for these children, and so plans are drawn up, and people are looking at the plans and thinking of all the wonderful things they're going to be able to do with this new addition when it's built, and then someone or some group says, but it's too expensive. We can't afford it. It's going to drive us into debt, and we don't want to be in debt as a congregation. You can think of a scenario like that. I was thinking of a scenario that came to my mind that really did happen in the 1980s when the whole issue of inclusive language was beginning to be felt in the church. And of course, there was a lot of dissension around that. And I was asked to do a workshop for a congregation in Winnipeg to talk about inclusive language. And I remember talking about it and how it might change our worship and why it was important when a couple of, dare I say it, elderly gentlemen stood up and said, well, I don't think this is a problem, And I don't think we should change our worship language just because somebody thinks it needs to be changed. And then a few people in the congregation said, but it is a problem. Sometimes the kind of language that's used makes me feel excluded. I don't feel that it describes me. Well, that's not what it's meant to do, so get over the problem, because we're not going to change. You know, and then you think, okay, now where do we go? Again, you've had those kind of experiences. You can fill in your own blanks about stories that you recall where the congregation has been in that kind of situation where there's dissension and it's hard to overcome it. Hopefully, we're able to come to some solution which keeps the community moving forward together. Sometimes the problems don't get resolved well, and some people leave the congregation in anger or just become inactive, not an active part of the congregation anymore. Some people leave the church when there are such conflicts, saying they didn't think a church would act like that. They didn't think we'd fight with each other. What kind of Christian community is this where you have disagreements and where you can't resolve your issues? How can we call ourselves Christian if that's the way we act with each other? You've heard those arguments too. Perhaps even express them from time to time. Perhaps for those people, the vision of what church would be like is more in tune with the one mentioned in the book of Acts, which was our other scripture lesson this morning. In that story, all who believed were of one heart and soul, and there was not a needy person among them, for their possessions were distributed to each in the community as any had need. There are many who kind of have a feel that that's the expression of Christian community, the ideal that we should be living up to. I have to admit that's the kind of Christian community that I really longed for a long time, where everything would be shared and everyone would be of the same heart and mind. Of course, some people are bothered by the apparent socialist, political and economic slant of the community, but being in tune with one heart and one mind sounds appealing. So maybe we could find a way around the political issues. As I say, I used to look wistfully at this passage as a vision of Christian community that would be wonderful to attain. I have to admit that as I've experienced community, I'm no longer drawn to that kind of community that I'm calling utopian communities, ones that just exist together with no dissension and with no problems. That no longer appeals to me. In 2010, I went on a retreat to the island of Iona in Scotland. And those of you who know me well, and I see some smiles, are saying, oh, that's his Mecca. It is. And I'm going back once more, by the way. It is my Mecca. I was there for my 70th birthday. I'm going to go back for my 80th birthday, wow. So I'm staying well till then. But it's a thin place for me, a place where my Celtic Christian sentiments and beliefs are rooted. So for me to go to Iona was a real pilgrimage. And I looked forward to closer contact with the Iona community. The rebuilding of the Abbey at Iona was the original reason for the Iona community to form. It was formed by a Scottish Presbyterian minister named George MacLeod in 1938. And since it's become an ecumenical community with worldwide connections and roots, there are something like 2,000 people who are part of the Iona community, a few of them living right on the island in very close community, and then others who are spread all over the world and who are part of that community. And they named their vision as to engage together and with people of goodwill across the world in acting, reflecting, and praying for justice, peace, and the integrity of creation. Convinced that the inclusive community we seek must be embodied in the community we practice. Now, the retreat that I attended was not under the auspices of the Iona community. It was in a hotel on the island, and it was a different leader and a different focus, but we attended the Abbey each morning and evening and worshiped with the Iona community. And I found the worship experience to be frustrating and troubling. Some of the messages seemed to me to project a closed and self-righteous attitude. For some of the community speakers, I got the sense that their community had the truth, and they were not interested in listening to anybody else, any other voices, other than their own. And I know that Jim was there on his sabbatical last summer, and that he had an experience that was somewhat similar to mine, that was there too, not too different. And in reading and in reflection, I sense that that can often become a problem for communities like that, who see themselves as a model for the rest of the world. Sometimes it gets to the point where the rest of the world doesn't have much to say to them, because they think they know what the truth is. And utopian communities like that can suffer dissent and conflict, just like every other community does. And sometimes some of those communities don't deal with that conflict and dissent in healthy ways. Sometimes their desire to preserve that utopian image can cause them to suppress the hard and troubling issues. And that can become a problem. In Vernon, I had a young woman who came to see me who belonged to a Christian community which lived in a kind of isolation from the wider community in order to preserve their unique Christian heritage and lifestyle. They had a separate kind of Christian community, which was, to some extent, to be a light to the rest of to the broader community at large. Their vision and their practice was governed by a group of quite autocratic elders. The young woman who came to see me had gone to the elders when she discovered that her husband had been unfaithful to her and to their wedding vows on a number of occasions. And when she went to tell the elders about that, she discovered that they already knew that. They told her that in their community, marriage was sacrosanct. Her job, therefore, was to be quiet and to continue being a good wife and to preserve their marriage, whatever the cost to her. Well, she came to see me after attending our church. After about a month away from that community, she was looking for another community which would be honest, and she'd come to our church for about a month and then came to me and asked if this might be a good community for her to sink her Christian roots in. And I told her I didn't think it was, because I thought she was going from a very closed, very controlled community where she was taught what she was supposed to think, to a very open and inclusive community where you might know the person next to you very well, but you didn't believe anything that they believed. And I said, I think that's too big a jump to make, and I suggested to her that she find a community somewhere in the middle that was not quite as open as the United Church is. And she did find that. She went to another church and she sank roots there, and I think she's part of that community there. Although she kept on coming to the United Church for several months after that, once in a while, because her kids liked our Sunday school better than the one that she was going to. So there you go. of course, the good things that we see in those utopian communities are not necessarily negated by the negative examples that I've given. There's all sorts of wonderful kinds of things that happen in those communities. But for me, it puts those two ideas of community on a level playing field. The utopian ones I'm talking about, where everyone shares and where everyone's of one mind, and our community that struggles along sometimes, finding ways to deal with dissent, sometimes not finding good ways to deal with dissent. But it seems to me that they're on level playing field, and it leaves me with the choice of what kind of community I would embrace. If I was given a choice, would I go to one of those communities that shares everything in common and is of the same heart or mind? Or would I choose a community like this one, with all of its warts and troubles? And I have to say, this is the community I would choose. I don't like conflict and dissension any more than you do. But that's what human communities are about, aren't they? We always have something that we disagree about. And the church is no different than the rest of society in that. And I believe that if we have a vision, a Christian vision of great love, that we think is a vision that the world needs to hear, then we need to learn how to live that vision in the same kind of community that other people are living in. I mean, the kind of community that's out there is a kind of community where there's always dissension. And if we can't learn to love, to trust, to care for each other, even when there's dissension and conflict in our community, how can we expect the world to act differently? If we're talking about a church community that is a witness to Christian love to the broader community, then I think the challenge is how we live together with differences and struggles, not suppressing those struggles and pretending they don't exist. I hope that as we struggle with the issues of community, whatever they are, we can learn how to overcome the things that divide us, how we can learn to hold the community together despite the issues that arise, how we can be about creating a community that is strong enough to weather the storms of disagreement or dissension that inevitably arise. If we can't do that within the church, then we have nothing of Jesus' vision to offer to the world outside the church. So I've tried to imagine myself being in Thomas's community. If I were one of the ones that had experienced the risen Christ and was, like everybody else, excited about it and bubbling over with ideas about what we can do together as a community now that Jesus is with us. And then all of a sudden, Thomas reigns on our parade. He's not going to be part of that kind of vision. What would I feel like in that situation? Well, I expect my first reaction would be exasperation. Thomas, get over it. Come and join the rest of us. And then, I hope, my mind might begin to go over ways in which we might bring Thomas into the center of that community and love him and cherish him, even if he never has an experience of the presence of the risen Christ. And then I hope, and I think, that I would have a sense of thanks that for all of his contrariness, Thomas is still a much loved part of that community. So let's have a few moments with our own thoughts and prayers.